in recent days that President Obama was specifically directing this. We now know at the very least Vice President Biden was in this up to his eyeballs. Yes?
If this happens to a current president, this would be an impeachable offense, if not criminal offense.
Can you imagine? Yeah.
Would you like to see criminal charges be brought against them?
I think we need to get to the bottom of this, and I think the first thing is to interview under oath the Director of National Intelligence and get to the bottom of what goes on with unmasking. How unusual is this that the entire upper echelon individually, it wasn't like one request for this, there were dozens of requests. Almost everybody in President Obama's top circle wanted to see this and wanted to listen to this conversation. But this is troubling because this isn't about national security. This is about eavesdropping on your opponent and eavesdropping on the new president's top advisors. So this is very, very troubling, and this was being led at least by Vice President Biden, if not the president. And we need to get to the bottom of it to make sure this never happens again, because really, for the average American, they're worried that this could happen to a top general like General Flynn, but can you imagine this power being unharnessed on an ordinary American? How would we defend ourselves?
Senator Paul, can you explain what was the most likely scenario here? That there was an intercepted call, the transcript was then circulated among senior staff, and then the various senior staff requested to know who was on the call? I mean, what is the most likely scenario as to why these names are on the list, or how this transpired?
Well, I think that's an important question. The way I read it is it looks like each of these administration officials actually individually requested to listen to this conversation. So it wasn't like someone says, well, why don't we have somebody go listen to this and send a transcript around? It sounds like each of these people individually did. And see, these rumors have been going around for years that the President Obama's administration was abusing this power of unmasking, and this sounds like they were abusing it to go after a political opponent, which I think is a very serious offense and should be investigated. And the fact that Vice President Biden is directly involved with unmasking a political opponent, think about it. Do you remember we went through this thing called impeachment? They said that President Trump was using the government to go after a political opponent. This is Vice President Biden using the spying powers of the United States to go after a political opponent. He's caught red-handed here. Vice President Biden's caught red-handed eavesdropping on a political opponent's phone calls. That, to me, is alarming.
And on that, this is a question from Fox of what impact should this have on Vice President Biden's campaign for president?
Every reporter in the country now needs to ask him a legitimate question. He needs to come out of hibernation, and they need to ask Vice President Biden, what kind of person eavesdrops? Is that something that we think is a legitimate function of government, to eavesdrop on your opponents without a warrant, to illegally unmask them and listen to their private conversation? No, from the very beginning, General Flynn's been treated very poorly by his country. A guy who served 33 years has been treated very poorly, but this is an abuse of power that should not rest, and it should make every American worry that if Vice President Biden were elevated to the top office, would he again use this kind of power on political opponents? And the other side needs to realize this is exactly what they were accusing President Trump of, but he was actually acquitted on that charge. They have now found that Vice President Biden is guilty of using government to go after a political opponent.
So, Senator, this is an NSA transcript intercept, it looks like. How do you think it came to be that the NSA intercepted this call, and then so many officials in the Obama administration were aware that the intercept existed? Does that surprise you at all that they would even know of this intercept that would be that widely circulated?
Well, that's an important question also. If you were to ask the people, you would have to ask the people involved, and you would say, what was your reason for listening to the Russian ambassador? Now, you can come up with a lot of reasons why the United States might listen to foreign ambassadors, and I think we probably do. But the question also remains, could they have been listening to the Russian ambassador as a roundabout, circuitous way of listening to General Flynn? And that's even more troubling, because many of us who have been worried about too much power in the intelligence community worry that you can have sort of a parallel construction of things. Like, let's say they want to get you, but they know they can't eavesdrop on you as a journalist, but they say, well, we know that you have a source in the Middle East, we're going to eavesdrop on him and then unmask you, but then maybe they can damage you. They can't maybe use that information in a court, but maybe they can leak that to something. Maybe it's about something personal in your life that they could use to damage you. There's all kinds of ways that it is very worrisome about unmasking people and about listening to their conversations. So they might have had a legitimate interest in listening to the Russian ambassador, but they have no interest in this. And here's the problem with unmasking. It could have been someone saying, you know, I know that voice. Well, he said he announced his voice at the beginning. He may announce it audibly, who it is, and say, hey, this is General Flynn when he's talking to the ambassador. It may have been announced on the phone call. So it doesn't become a big secret, then that circulates around. But what happens in government, if some people have bias and they say this is juicy information, we could use this, then it may start that way. So it could be nefarious from the beginning, and they tapped the Russian ambassador to get to General Flynn, or it could be that it's incidentally found and they're like, wow, let's take advantage of this. But it looks like President Obama's administration was lapping this up, you know, and using this to go after a political opponent. This is very, very damning.
So Fox also just wanted to follow up and ask, what makes you so sure about Biden, as Grassley and Johnson just said, potentially involved with these documents? And
the documents that we've passed out to you, and you're welcome to take pictures of, say that Vice President Biden did access and unmask General Flynn, and that means that he either personally had to sign a document to unmask him. I mean, these are questions we can get better to the specifics of by talking to the Director of National Intelligence about how the process works. But there's a list of people: President Obama's Chief of Staff, Vice President Biden, James Clapper, James Comey, John Brennan. It sounds like the entire upper circle, Samantha Powers, of President Obama was listening to this and realized they did not have permission to listen to General Flynn. You have to get a warrant to listen to an American's conversation, and this is not just any American. This is an American who is your political opponent. Vice President Biden accessed the identity and the private conversation of a political opponent. If there is no more clear violation of a politician using their office and abusing their office to go after a political opponent. And I think he's caught red-handed here. And I'm very thankful that this has been declassified so we can get to the truth of the matter.
Senator, how will this play into the ongoing debate over surveillance that's going on right now?
Right. And I think that's an important question, because really I'd like to see real reform, not just making people pay a penalty for abusing the power. I'd like to see the power go away. I have an amendment that would say this, that the FISA Court, which doesn't really use the Constitution, the FISA uses a standard that you have to have probable cause not of a crime, which it says in the Fourth Amendment. It says you have to have probable cause that you're connected to a government. I think that was unfairly used against President Trump, but I'm more concerned about it being used against anybody, anywhere, anytime. So I have an amendment that says the FISA Court shouldn't be used on Americans, and Americans should be excluded from that court, because I don't think you can fix the FISA Court. The other amendments are to try to fix it, and some of them I think do make it less bad, and I'll support some of the reforms. But really, if we don't want this to happen to another president of any party, I think what you have to do is admit that the FISA Court isn't constitutional for U.S. citizens. Yes.
Are you suggesting that the former vice president did something illegal or unauthorized with this request?
I think the best way to describe it at this point is an abuse of power. And so, for example, when they were clamoring and saying President Trump was abusing his power by withholding this, much of it didn't center on legality. Remember, there was this debate over what was legal or illegal. Most people really gave up on the argument that President Trump did anything illegal. They said he was abusing his power to investigate a political opponent. Now, we rejected that, and then the president was acquitted in the Senate. But this is exactly the same kind of scenario. The vice president and a cabal of President Obama's inner circle abused their power to go after a political opponent and to bring him down, and then to plot with various ways to bring him down. You know, should we use the Logan Act? Should we, what are the ways that we can bring him down? Should we try to trick him into lying? So, yes, and it sounds like this was directed from the very top. There are already people admitting that it was coming from the White House. The question really is, was Vice President leading this effort to go after General Flynn, or was it President Obama? Yes.
We would call for a congressional investigation on this entire thing.
Absolutely, and I will start with an invitation. Today we're issuing an invitation to the Director of National Intelligence, Rick Grinnell, to come before my subcommittee and to testify concerning this. And we do need to get to the bottom of this. This is potentially the largest abuse of power that I can imagine in recent history. And it goes to the heart of the question of what type of person would that person be leading the country and in charge of this amazing power of the intelligence community power.
Sir, do you think a Department of Justice investigation is necessary here?
I think this can't be investigated in enough ways. And I'm disappointed that there have been people out there, I think, who have known this for a long time. But it took some I think, conscientious people now in government to say the American public should get to judge for themselves whether President Biden listening to the Vice President Biden listening to the one of the president's top advisors' private phone calls, whether that was inappropriate. That would be a mild term, whether it was an abuse of power or whether it was a crime. And the only way we'll get to the bottom of this is to have an investigation.
Some could say that this could change the entire political race.
I think it's an amazing accusation. It is incredibly potent, and this is not going to go away quietly. But it fits into my point that the abuse of power in the intelligence community can happen with either party, any person, and that's why we should take away that power so no one is tempted to use that power against their political opponents. Thanks. And you guys all got copies of all the stuff?